It began not with a gunshot, but with a ballot. By November of 1860, the United States was a nation existing in two separate realities. On one side was an industrializing North that had grown increasingly intolerant of the institution of human bondage. On the other was an agrarian South that viewed slavery not just as an economic necessity, but as the very foundation of its social order. When the results of the 1860 presidential election came in, it confirmed the South's deepest fears. Abraham Lincoln, a man who had not appeared on the ballot in 10 southern states, had won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. The political fracture was absolute. South Carolina did not wait for his inauguration. On December 20th, 1860, the state voted unanimously to repeal its ratification of the Constitution and dissolve its union with the United States. It was a domino effect. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within weeks. They formed a new government in Montgomery, Alabama, and drafted a constitution that explicitly protected slavery. They chose Jefferson Davis as their president. The nation watched in paralyzed silence as federal forts and arsenals across the South were seized by these new Confederate forces. Only two significant forts remained in Union hands. One of them was Fort Sumter, sitting isolated on a man-made island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The situation was a stalemate until Lincoln made the decision to resupply the starving garrison. He notified South Carolina's governor of his intent to send only food. The Confederacy saw this as an act of aggression. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries opened fire. For 34 hours, over 3,000 shells rained down on the fort. Remarkably, not a single human life was lost during the bombardment itself, but the Union was shattered. Major Robert Anderson surrendered the fort. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion for a period of 3 months. This call to arms pushed the Upper South over the edge. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded rather than fight their neighbors. The Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia. This placed the enemy capital a mere 100 miles from Washington, D.C. Everyone expected a short conflict. They thought one decisive battle would settle the dispute. They were tragically wrong. The first major clash came in July 1861 near a railroad junction called Manassas, or Bull Run. Washington's elite rode out in carriages with picnic baskets to watch the spectacle, expecting a swift Union victory to end the rebellion before dinner. The battle was a chaotic mess of inexperienced soldiers and confusing uniforms. Initially, the Union forces drove the Confederates back, but a Virginia brigade stood firm behind their commander, Thomas Jackson, who earned the nickname Stonewall that day. The Confederates counterattacked. The Union retreat turned into a panicked rout as soldiers mixed with fleeing civilians on the road back to Washington. The illusion of a bloodless war evaporated. Lincoln realized this would be a long struggle. He appointed George McClellan to build the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a brilliant organizer who loved his men, but he possessed a fatal flaw. He was paralyzed by caution. He spent months drilling the army and demanding more troops, constantly convinced he was outnumbered. While the East settled into a stalemate, the war in the West was moving faster. A disheveled brigadier general named Ulysses S. Grant began capturing key rivers. In February 1862, he took Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, demanding unconditional surrender. It was the first major Union success, but the cost of war revealed itself at Shiloh in April 1862. It was a battle of unprecedented savagery. Fighting in hornets' nests and peach orchards, the two armies butchered each other for 2 days. When the smoke cleared, there were over 23,000 casualties. This number was more than all previous American wars combined. The nation was horrified. In the East, Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate Army in June 1862. He was aggressive and brilliant. Through the 7 days battles and the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee completely outmaneuvered Union forces, inflicting heavy defeats and clearing Virginia of Federal troops. Riding this wave of momentum, Lee decided to take the war into the North. He hoped a victory on Union soil would encourage European powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and force a peace settlement. Lee's army crossed into Maryland in September 1862. As luck would have it, a Union soldier found a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars. McClellan finally had the advantage. The armies met at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg. September 17, 1862, remains the single bloodiest day in American history. Over 22,000 men fell in 12 hours of fighting. The battle was a tactical draw, but Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. It was the victory Lincoln needed. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order fundamentally changed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a war to preserve the Union. It was now a moral crusade against slavery. This diplomatic masterstroke made it politically impossible for Britain or France to intervene on the side of the South. But the fighting on the ground remained grim for the North. In December 1862, Union forces were slaughtered at Fredericksburg, attacking entrenched positions. In May 1863, Lee achieved his greatest tactical victory at Chancellorsville, defeating an army twice his size. But it came at a terrible price. Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men and died days later. Lee decided to gamble everything on another invasion of the North. He marched into Pennsylvania. The two armies collided almost by accident at a crossroads town called Gettysburg. For 3 days in July 1863, over 160,000 men fought for the soul of the country. It culminated in Pickett's charge, a doomed Confederate infantry assault across a mile of open ground. They were decimated by Union artillery and rifle fire. Lee lost 1/3 of his army and retreated. He would never invade the North again. At the exact same moment, 1,000 miles to the west, Ulysses S. Grant achieved a victory of equal strategic importance. After a months-long siege, he captured Vicksburg on July 4, 1863. This gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and sliced the Confederacy in two. The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the beginning of the end for the South. Lincoln finally found the general who could finish the job. He promoted Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies in March 1864. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. He would leverage the North's superior numbers and industrial mined the Confederate armies into dust. He would coordinate simultaneous offensives. While he stayed in Virginia to hunt Lee, he ordered William Tecumseh Sherman to drive deep into the Confederate heartland of Georgia. The nature of the war changed. It was no longer about capturing cities. It was about destroying the enemy's ability to wage war. In Virginia, Grant engaged Lee in the Overland Campaign. It was a non-stop 6-week battle. At the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, the casualties were appalling. The Union lost 55,000 men in just over a month. This was nearly equal to the size of Lee's entire army. Northern newspapers called Grant a butcher. But unlike his predecessors, Grant did not retreat. He kept moving south, pinning Lee down in a siege at Petersburg, a vital railroad hub just south of Richmond. In the West, Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864. This victory was crucial as it virtually guaranteed Lincoln's re-election that November. Sherman then did the unthinkable. He cut his own supply lines and marched 60,000 men from Atlanta to the sea. His objective was to make the South howl. His troops destroyed railroads, seized crops, and burned infrastructure across a 60-mile wide path. He captured Savannah in December, offering the city to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. He then turned north into the Carolinas, bringing the destruction to the cradle of the secession. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Its armies were starving, its soldiers were deserting, and its cities were in ruins. On April 2nd, Grant finally broke through the lines at Petersburg. The Confederate government fled Richmond, and the Union Army entered the city the next day. Lee attempted to escape west to link up with remaining Confederate forces, but Grant cut him off. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses S. Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's home at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee wore his finest dress uniform while Grant arrived in a mud-splattered private's coat. The terms were generous. Confederates would not be prosecuted for treason. Officers could keep their sidearms. Men could keep their horses to plant crops for the spring. The Army of Northern Virginia surrendered. The war was effectively over. The celebration was short-lived. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a play. John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and fired a single bullet into the back of Lincoln's head. The president died the next morning. The man who had held the Union together through its darkest hour would not live to see the peace he had won. The cost of the war was staggering. Approximately 750,000 soldiers lay dead. This was 2% of the American population. A comparable loss today would be over 6 million lives. The South was economically devastated and socially upended. 4 million enslaved people were free, but faced an uncertain future in a reconstructing nation. The United States had been preserved, but it was a different country than the one that existed in 1860. It was no longer a loose collection of states, but a singular, solidified nation, forged in the fires of a 4-year apocalypse. The House had ceased to be divided, but the scars of the rift would remain visible for centuries.